So far, all of the topics in this sermon series have been big questions that have emerged from the realm of the cerebral. Questions like, who is God? And the nature of baptism, and our doctrinal understanding of United Methodism, and the relationship between Bible and truth have all, for the most part, been an intellectual exercise. But today, the big question that requires a short answer is probably the one among all of them that cuts us the most deeply, that gets to us in the most intimate, directly personal way possible. It is the one question that I think all of us have probably wondered at one point in our lives, but it is certainly one that has lingered the longest. It's the question that keeps us up at night. It's the question that makes us stare out into the darkness in our rooms. It's the one that makes us confront the cold, hard reality of life itself. It's the one that reveals parts of our soul, components of our doubt and our skepticism that we would rather ignore. It is, in some ways, the toughest question of the big questions. And it's the one question of all the ones that we are tackling in this sermon series that just might challenge our belief in God to begin with. Author Walter Isaacson, in his best-selling book called Steve Jobs, about the well-known founder of Apple and CEO of that company, relays a story of how the parents of Steve Jobs wanted their son to grow up in the Christian faith. And so at one point, when he was just a young boy, they started attending their local Lutheran church regularly. When Jobs was 13 years old, he paid a visit to his Lutheran pastor and stopped by his office, and in his hand was a magazine. It was a copy of Life magazine from July 12th, 1969. And on the cover of that magazine were the pictures of some hungry, starving children, innocent victims of the ongoing brutal war between Nigeria and Biafra. Jobs went to his Lutheran pastor and began by asking a question. He said, "If I hold up my fingers, does God know how many fingers I'm going to hold up?" The pastor responded quickly, "Yes, of course. God knows everything." So then Jobs got serious. He slid the magazine across the desk, revealed the cover to the preacher, and said, "Does God know about this? Does God know what is going to happen to these children?" The preacher responded the way many preachers do, the way I have at times. He started stammering. He started blubbering out whatever he could think of. Yes, yes. God knows everything, and we can't understand all that God is, he stammered on and on. Jobs then announced to that Lutheran preacher that he didn't want to have anything to do with any kind of religion that believed in a God like that. So Walter Isaacson says in his book that from that moment on, Steve Jobs never stepped foot in a church again. Now, you and I can find ourselves in that story rather easily and very quickly. There are many entry points into this story for us. Steve Jobs required a trigger, a story. In his case, it was the war between Nigeria and Biafra. For you and me, the stories are countless. The triggers that have prompted that question deep within our own personal lives are varied and they are numerous. The death of a loved one, the breakdown of a marriage, the inability to conceive, And then there are global stories that have plagued all of us, so embedded within our collective human consciousness that we only need to conjure them up with just a single word. Sandy Hook, Katrina, Columbine, 9/11. These are stories that all seem to ask a question. And there are many voices that have asked it. But the essentials of that question are usually the same. Why do innocent people suffer? And what is God's relationship to that suffering? Where is the justice in a world that is filled with so much injustice? The relationship of God to justice is the very basis for that important word that theologians have created to describe just this very conundrum. It's the word theodicy. That's the classical theological term to describe this problem. Theodicy, from two Greek root words, theos meaning God, dike meaning justice. In a sense, it is the question of how we can reconcile the God of justice with a world that is filled with so much injustice. The classical way to ask the theodicy problem is this: a very simple question that has three important components. How? If God is all-loving and all-powerful, then why is there suffering and evil in the world? If God is all-loving and God is all-powerful, then why is there suffering and evil in the world? It's a classic problem. Because if there is suffering and evil in the world, and by most evidences there is plenty of it, then either God can't stop it or God doesn't want to. That is the question that has plagued Christians and non-believers alike for generations. And I would say that it is the one question that for many skeptics and many non-believers, it is the one barrier that prevents them from believing in God. In my experience in the ministry, those skeptics and doubters, those atheists and agnostics that I have talked to have all pointed to this problem of suffering and evil as the one piece that cannot be reconciled and therefore is the piece that prevents them from believing in God. And frankly, I have known way too many believers, Christians just like us, in fact, maybe some of you, for whom the question of suffering and evil is the one question that causes you to waver in your faith and even tempts you to walk away from it. It's the difficulty in solving this problem that is the reason why one of my favorite authors and professors of preaching, Tom Long, once described this as the, quote, impossible chess match. An impossible chess match between two sides that are warring at each other and that battle can never be reconciled. On the one side is all that we have ever believed or wanted to believe about God, about a God who is all-loving and all-powerful. That's the God that we want to believe in, the God that we have been led to believe in. That is on one side of the chessboard, but on the other hand, there is the reality of all the suffering and the evil in the world that we cannot ignore and that we cannot deny. This is the impossible chess match for which there is no easy resolution. I love that image. But the truth is, it's not original to Tom Long, because people have been asking that question and posing that problem for generations in the history of God's people, beginning with, of all places, our very own Bible. For it's right there, smack dab in the middle of the Old Testament, that we have a kind of impossible chess match going on. And a very peculiar and strategically placed collection of books. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, that we have now collectively, popularly termed wisdom literature. They're all grouped together, and they're all strategically placed right in the middle of all of the historical narrative, right in the midst of the action of the Old Testament, right there in the midst of Exodus and exile, right between faithfulness and unfaithfulness, justice and injustice, triumph and punishment, disobedience and fear. It's like the wisdom literature in the Old Testament is like this intermission right in the middle of a play, or kind of a halftime show in the middle of a game, except this time, this halftime show is in the form of a chess match, of a dialogue, commentary between and among all these books, where they are reflecting on all of the action that we've experienced so far and anticipating all of the action to come. And just here that we have two opposing sides. On the one side of the chessboard, we have Psalms and Proverbs. Beautiful pastoral words from two of the most beloved books in the entire Bible. Words like, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Words like, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Words like from the Proverbs, my son, keep all my commandments, for then your days shall be long and your years will prosper. We like that kind of God. That's the kind of God we want to believe in. A God that's all loving, a God that's all powerful. And if we will only trust in that God, believe in that God, and do what that God wants us to do, then all will be well. A God who is all loving and all powerful. But then we skip to the other end of the chessboard in the form of Job and Ecclesiastes. And there we hear a very different kind of word. A story about a man who suffered intensely. Tragedy after tragedy. For no rational reason whatsoever, he lost just about everything for no good reason at all. And it is there that we hear the words of Ecclesiastes, where the teacher, having surveyed all of the complexities and mysteries of the world, comes to this haunting conclusion that none of it matters. Vanity of vanities, Ecclesiastes says. All of it is vanity. It is just a whisper, just a breath. It is just a puff of air, because in the end, none of it will last and none of it matters. That is the kind of reality of the world that we would love to ignore, but we can't. And this is the chess match that is happening right there in the middle of our own Bible. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the wisdom literature? With these voices from the biblical narrative that are at odds with each other? Perhaps the reason that the wisdom literature is in our Bible is to give us permission to engage those questions ourselves. To make us unafraid to acknowledge our doubts and our deepest skepticism about how we can reconcile a God of love and power with the injustice, suffering, and evil that's in the world. Maybe the Bible, in fact, does not want us to ignore our innermost questions, but to be unafraid to ask them. Because after all, it's not the only place in the Bible where this chess match is going on. You skip ahead to the New Testament, and you discover, right there in the midst of our scripture reading this morning, the same kind of chess match going on. You heard Sheila read that story for you earlier this morning. It was a parable that Jesus told about a landowner and some servants who were caring for a field. And then one morning, the servants woke up to discover that, in the words of the parable, evil had entered the land and had planted weeds to grow up right next to the wheat. And so the servants turned to the landowner And they said, Master, shouldn't something be done about the weeds? Shouldn't there be something done to eradicate this evil that has come into our land? Which is another way of asking God, why don't you just say the word and make all this suffering and evil go away? And it is in that parable that we get right to the heart of the theodicy problem. Ultimately, the question of suffering and evil becomes a question about who we believe God is. If God is all-loving and all-powerful, then why is there suffering and evil in the world? Now, those are three important pieces to this puzzle, for which there is no easy or convenient way to make them all work together. God's all-loving kindness, God's omnipotence, and the reality of suffering and evil are three pieces that cannot coexist together. It is a logical and theological impossibility to make them all work together, which means that the only way to begin to address the problem of theodicy is to attempt to try to reframe, reinterpret, reconceive one or more of those 3 points. And in fact, every strategy that's ever been invented by anyone in the history of the Christian church has fallen into one of the 3 categories of reframing God's loving kindness or God's omnipotence or the reality of suffering and evil. So we have some choices to make. Which one of those 3 are we going to reinterpret? And frankly, I'm not sure that I can do anything with God's all-loving kindness. There have been some attempts, I suppose, in the history of the church to try to diminish God's love for humanity. And that's not an option for me. Because I cannot, in good faith as a United Methodist, do anything to compromise God's love for all the world. Because after all, as a Methodist, I believe that to be a Christian means to have God's love shed abroad in my heart. And frankly, if God doesn't love the world, then friends, we have bigger problems than we even thought. So some people will skip to the third option. In fact, this may be the most popular and widespread option of all of them, which is to try to diminish the reality and the power of suffering and evil in the world by trying to reconceive suffering and misery to be something less than what it really is. So that's why you get very well-intentioned phrases from people who in the midst of suffering say, "Oh, but don't worry, God has a purpose for this," right? Or, "Don't worry, that suffering is there simply to teach us a lesson." Or, "That misery will simply help us build character." I think all of those reasons came from my father one day when I was a child. Because this is what we tell our kids. "Trust me, this hurts me more than it hurts you." I try telling that at a graveside of a family where the parents have just buried their child. Or try telling that to a couple that's been trying years to conceive their own child. Or try telling that to a family that's grieving along the side of a road as their teenager has been killed by a hit-and-run accident. Sometimes suffering is just suffering. And there is absolutely no reason to sugarcoat it. So if we can't do anything with God's loving kindness, and if we can't really do anything to diminish the reality and power of suffering and evil in the world, then maybe the place to find even just a little bit of wiggle room in this ongoing problem of theodicy is to begin to look at God's power in a different way. What might it mean to say that God has a different kind of power that is not all powerful? Because after all, I would remind you that as United Methodists, we believe that human beings have free will, right? I mean, we have the capacity to choose, which means that we have even just a little bit of power to make something happen. And if we have just a little bit of power, then God then, by definition, doesn't have all the power. Otherwise, we would just be puppets and robots rather than human beings with free will. And so, rather than try to equate God's omnipotence with omnicausality, which means that God causes all things to happen, then maybe God's power is something different. Not a power to make all things happen, but a power to call creation into cooperation. Maybe God is powerful not because God forces us to do certain things, but because God calls us to do certain things and requires our cooperation to make it happen. Maybe God is powerful not because God coerces things to happen, but because God calls us to cooperation with a kind of powerful persuasiveness that is in fact the most powerful force in the world. Maybe God is powerful in the way that God chooses not to ignore our suffering or be absent from our suffering, but is powerful enough to identify right there in the midst of our suffering, and ultimately powerful enough to transform that suffering into the possibilities of new life and new hope and resurrection. Maybe the kind of power that we're talking about is best symbolized by a cross. The pivotal moment in all of human history, when God chose not to ignore the cross or to sidestep the cross or avoid the suffering and evil embodied by the cross, but chose to take it on head on so that God can identify with all the crosses that we bear, and so that God could transform the misery of the cross into the power of the resurrection. So maybe God's power, after all, is not coercive, but powerfully persuasive. In other words, maybe God's power is not an ability to make things happen or even keep things from happening, but in God's constant and faithful way of luring you, of wooing us, of persuading us to choose right rather than wrong, even up until the very last second. To choose better rather than worse. And in fact, that kind of power is the most persuasive power in the entire world. Aesop tells a story in one of his fables of a conversation that's going on between the sun and the north wind. And the two of them are having a debate about which one of them was more powerful, the sun or the wind. After going round and round in this verbal contest, at one point the wind says, okay, you know what? Let's settle this contest once and for all to decide who has more power. They looked down upon the earth and they saw a man traveling along a path. And he was wearing a very heavy, warm winter coat. The wind said to the sun, do you see that man with the coat? Let's see which one of us can take the coat off this man. And the one who can take the coat off the man has more power. And then the north wind said, I'll try first. So the wind began to blow. A blustering, gale force wind that made the buildings rattle, that made the trees shake, that made the birds cling tightly to the branches, that was so cold and blustery that frost started to form on the ground, trying to blow this coat literally off the man's back, but instead it only made the man cling to his coat even more tightly. So then the sun said, "Step aside, wind." The sun then broke through the clouds. And instead of trying to force the coat off the man's back, the sun simply radiated warmth, heat, light. Suddenly the frost melted off the ground. The light bore down from the sky. The ground started to get warm. The temperature started to get hot, all because of the warmth and radiance of the sun. And eventually, the man stopped clinging to his coat so tightly and made a choice to take off his coat and lay it aside so that he could sit down in a shady spot on the ground. Aesop tells the fable in a way that ends with this final question. The wind said to the sun, "That was amazing. How did you do it?" To which the sun responded, "It was easy, because it's not about having all the power. It's about having the right kind of power, the persuasive power." Now, friends, I know that many of us, if not most of us, look at this question of suffering and evil right now in the most personal way possible. The reasons that this question is so personal for us are varied and numerous, and you could readily fill in the blank with your own reality of misery and suffering within your own life right now. And as you've pondered the great theodicy question, struggled with the reality of God's love, the possibility of God's power in the midst of your own suffering, there may be a part of you that's really struggling with who God is and where God is and how God is operating in your life. I want you to know this morning that God is all-loving and that God has a power at work in your life right now. Maybe not a kind of power that would make your problems go away, but a kind of power that you really need to hear, that I really need to hear today, about a God who's powerful enough to be with you, to identify with your suffering right in the midst of it. A God who chooses through the cross to identify with us in Jesus, to remind us that we are not alone. And a power to give you a sense of hope, even though there is evidence to the contrary all around you. Whenever you feel even just a smidge hopeful, or the possibility of resurrection in your life, or that perhaps there can be new life emerging from the darkness, that, in fact, is the power of God to give you irrational hope, a nonsensical belief in the power of possibility in Christ. And what's more, God's power is calling you to be an agent of healing for someone else's suffering today. That you, in fact, can be the very agent of healing for someone else who's suffering. And so, for this big question of the problem of suffering and evil, here is your short answer. Ultimately, the problem of suffering and evil is a question about God's power. And it is on the cross that we discover what that power really is. A power to identify with us in the midst of our suffering. A power to persuade us, even till the last second, to choose right rather than wrong, love rather than hate. A power to call all of us to be agents of healing for other people, a power to listen to us when we cry out in anguish, even in the midst of our doubts, and a power to show us resurrection, even when all we see is death. That's the ultimate point of the parable of the wheat and the weeds, that at the end of the day, the landowner says that when all hope is lost and the weeds are as tall as the wheat, that's when we will discover a new kind of power, the power to preserve life, even in the midst of hardship. And so it is, brothers and sisters, that we come now to the point in God's word for us that we look deep within our own souls and dare to ask the question, for what are we in need of healing today?